Almost overnight, she went from a possible witness to a person of interest in the case of a missing mom of 5 from New Canaan. The girlfriend in the middle of a bitter and brutal divorce battle.
The stuff you were throwing out, we have. And it's all Jennifer. It belongs to Jennifer. Do you understand?
Turned high-profile murder investigation.
Guys, what happened to Jennifer McLaughlin?
We're taking you inside the trial of Michelle Troconis.
And thanks for joining us once again for Inside the Trial of Michelle Troconis. I'm Shannon Miller. We are more than 3 weeks now into the state's case, and we're digging into some of the key findings of the DNA analysis done on the Albany Avenue evidence and the Toyota Tacoma. Kristen Maydale from the State Forensics Lab back on the stand to lay out what was and what was not found on samples sent to the lab. Now, this testimony lets the jury in on what we already knew through the arrest warrant for Michelle Troconis. You can see on the left there are pieces of evidence. In the middle, the results of that testing. Most of the DNA results were consistent with Jennifer Dulos. 2 DNA matches and some fingerprints of Fotis Dulos, and then 2 swabs from garbage bags were consistent with Michelle Troconis. Her attorney insisting, though, that the amount of his client's DNA found was minuscule.
The suggestion that her DNA was all over these items is therefore, in my view, not borne out.
Our Kevin Geis is live outside of Stanford Superior Court once again. And Kevin, we are coming off of a dense day of DNA testimony. Any idea what the jury is set to see next?
Absolutely. Well, to borrow a phrase from the judge himself, the prosecutors aren't going to show their hand at all during this case. But we have learned from the attorney of Pavel Gumieni that Pavel himself is expected to take the stand here in Stanford today. Now, we know from a prior statement that he's looking forward to getting this testimony over with so he can go back to focusing on his work and his family. But first, let's talk a little bit about that DNA evidence. For the first time, the jury heard about DNA coming from the defendant, Michelle Troconis. Kristen Maydale from the State Forensics Lab read the results of the swabbing taken from garbage bags found along Albany Avenue.
The DNA profile from item 883S7 is at least 780,000 times more likely to occur if it originated from Michelle Troconis and 3 unknown individuals than if it originated from 4 unknown individuals.
The lab also did an analysis on a new DNA profile collected from Michelle Troconis last year in 2023 and using a new kit. The results were consistent with the analysis done in 2019. The amount of DNA, though, a sticking point for the defense. Schoenhorn had the DNA expert check the math, calculating just how little the amount was.
If a 0.420 nanogram, that equals 420 picograms, correct?
Correct.
And that 5% of 420 is the number is 21 picograms, correct?
Correct.
And that you already indicated is approximately 3 human skin cells, right?
Approximately, yes.
And therefore, to do that math, that would be the equivalent of 21 trillionths of 1 gram, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so it's pretty small.
Very small, yes.
Now, the source of that DNA isn't something that the lab is able to test for unless they do a confirmatory blood test. But on this item, they did not do that confirmatory blood test. Shannon.
All right. Attorney Schoenhorn again, quick to point out the differences between what was laid out in that arrest warrant and what the expert testifies was actually found during her examination. Now, Kevin, the prosecution and the defense both throwing out scenarios for how that DNA may have gotten there. Attorney Sean McGinnis asked Maydale about a statement Troconis made in her 3rd interview, which the jury has not yet seen.
The defendant in her 3rd interview with police indicated to them that she held a bag open for Mr. Dulos as he deposited something in the bag. Is it possible that her DNA could have gotten on the bag as she was holding it?
Yes, that's possible. We know that if you come in contact with something, it is possible for you to leave your own DNA behind on an item.
Now, on cross-examination, attorney John Schoenhorn posed his own hypotheticals about how his client's DNA may have gotten onto that bag.
If a person were to pull a garbage bag out of a roll and put their hand to prevent the next one from pulling out, so you pull it off one, would that scenario be consistent with leaving some DNA on the next bag?
if your bare hand is coming in contact with an item, yes, it's possible that you can leave DNA behind.
If Ms. Troconis was in a truck, and a truck with another contributor, such as Mr. Doulos, touching either the seat or the hand of Mr. Doulos, and then he were to then deposit a garbage bag into a receptacle, would that also be consistent with a manner in which that her DNA could be transferred to the exterior of such bag?
Secondary transfer can occur. Just so many factors contribute to that. We don't know if the person is a shedder. That makes a big difference for that initial transfer of DNA. If you transfer more DNA to someone's hand, then there's a better chance that that DNA will then transfer to that other object. And with each subsequent transfer, you're losing that initial DNA that you started with.
So, Kevin, what is the jury supposed to make of all of these scenarios? It sounds like really any of the ways that McGinnis or Schoenhorn explained how her DNA could have gotten there are possible, according to Maydell's testimony. And I should mention, the jury hasn't even heard yet about potentially what investigators say happened at the Mountain Spring property before they went to Albany Avenue. So they're just kind of laying the groundwork, it sounds like, for how this could have all played out.
Absolutely. The jury had a chance to hear quite a bit. So many hypotheticals at one point that the Judge Kevin Randolph actually had to rein them in. Ultimately, the jury has to sort of determine for themselves which theory they're willing to buy more into or continue to hear more testimony, both from the state and the defense. Of course, the easiest way the defense could clear it up would be to put Michelle Troconis on the stand herself. But John Schoenhorn has not indicated one way or another if he and the client are willing to do that.
Kevin, we've been waiting to hear a big part of all this, the forensic evidence found on the Toyota Tacoma that may connect the vehicle to the crime and an alleged cleanup. It wasn't much compared to what was found along Albany Avenue, but one finding could be significant to the state's case. We're talking about those seats which were removed from the Toyota Tacoma and then handed over to police by Doulos's four-group employee, Pavel Gumiani. Investigators testified about taking a cutting from the seat cover of a spot that had a positive result of a blood screening test but was never confirmed as blood. Now, Maydell testified that it was consistent with Jennifer Doulos's DNA.
Assuming one individual, the DNA profile from item 86S1 is at least 100 billion times more likely to occur if it originated from the source of the DNA profile from the swabbing of the electric toothbrush than if it originated from an unknown individual.
Now, investigators believe that Fotis Doulos used Pavel Gumiani's Tacoma to drive down to New Canaan the morning Jennifer disappeared. He killed her down there, they say, and then drove back that truck to Farmington. Jennifer's body, as you know, has never been found. And while that cutting did have DNA on it, the rest of the swabbings taken from the Tacoma did not generate any DNA profiles. That includes swabbings taken from the door and the license plate, screws, and washers. Attorney Sean McGinnis asked Maydell about what would cause DNA to be removed from an item.
How, if at all, could a car being detailed impact potential DNA evidence found in the car?
Well, as of any wiping or cleaning that we talked about before, that can remove any DNA that may be left behind or any biological material.
And could that also potentially prevent DNA profiles from being generated on objects tested?
Correct. We wouldn't have enough DNA to be detected, therefore would not generate a profile.
So, Kevin, clearly the state here hammering home that point that the Tacoma was washed, it was detailed, it was thoroughly cleaned, and that is why they didn't find any sort of significant DNA inside the vehicle. The cleaning of the Tacoma is something the prosecution alleges that Troconis allegedly helped play a role in and actually ending up leading to her second arrest, right?
Right. We heard multiple times about sort of the cleaning of the Tacoma, how clean the Tacoma was from Matthew Riley back when he testified about how much he was pulling out of the Tacoma and how little there was to actually pull out of the Tacoma. So we've heard about the cleaning multiple times, and that's actually somewhere inside the warrant where the prosecutors pull Michelle Troconis into this entire scheme, let's call it. So they continue to pull Michelle Troconis in through the cleaning of the Tacoma, and we're expected to hear more about about the cleaning of the Tacoma today and in future testimony.
Yeah, and Michelle Troconis telling those investigators that Fotis Dulos had told her he was cleaning spilled coffee out of the Tacoma. So more to hear on that. Let's go back to the cutting from the Tacoma seats that had DNA from Jennifer Dulos on it. Is there any reason that she would be in the Toyota Tacoma that belonged to Pavel Gumieni?
Not that we know of at this point. We're expecting to hear a little bit from Pavel Gumieni himself today. So if there was any sort of relationship between the two, if they knew each other, we know Pavel Gumieni was an employee of Fotis Dulos for a long time, even predating the divorce itself. So if there was any sort of relationship there, it's likely that prosecutors and the defense would bring up any sort of relationship, especially the defense, if they're trying to prove the point that Jennifer Dulos had a reason to be inside that Toyota Tacoma. But I would expect prosecutors to likely bring that up first.
Yeah, we have heard again, while he was a four-group employee, he was also a family friend. Jennifer would often ask him for help around the house with certain items and certain things that she needed help with. Now, all of these pieces of evidence were also compared to samples from the nanny, Lauren Almeida, and the Dulos children, as well as Pavel Gumieni. And when it comes to him, there was a bit of a surprise in the DNA findings.
In comparing the mitochondrial DNA profile from 88-1-1S2-01 and the known from 94, submission number 94, which is Pavel's known, are the same. Therefore, Pavel Gumieni or another member of the same maternal lineage cannot be excluded as the source of item.
So for the very first time, we have now heard that a hair recovered from a sponge found in the evidence dumped along Albany Avenue matched the profile of Pavel Gumieni. Mitochondrial DNA is not like nuclear DNA. Nuclear DNA is unique to an individual, whereas mitochondrial DNA is not. Schoenhorn had this to say about the discovery.
How Pavel Gumieni's hair got onto a scrubber sponge found inside one of those bags. But, or at least, maybe it's his mother's hair. I don't know.
So it's unclear how that hair would have gotten there, Kevin, and we're expecting, again, Gumieni's testimony sometime today. Again, we know that Troconis' family is upset that he was granted immunity in the case. We heard about that during those suppression hearings. So, Kevin, does it look like or seem like that Attorney John Schoenhorn is implying that Gumieni may have had more involvement than we've originally heard or what's originally been reported by investigators? Of course, his job is to create this reasonable doubt for the jury.
Right. Reasonable doubt is a whole part of the defense. It's really his main job as the defense attorney. So we're expecting him to continue to sort of push a little bit of reasonable doubt on the jury as far as finding Pavel Gumieni's hair on that sponge that was located on Albany Avenue in Hartford. When I was able to contact Pavel's attorney, Lindy Urso, yesterday, he did tell me that that's something that isn't necessarily super shocking to him, though that was the first time he was hearing about the hair that was found on the sponge. But he believes there's a perfectly logical explanation, and it will come up in testimony today.
Wow. And we know that Lindy Urso, Kevin, has represented Pavel Gumieni for years now. So interesting to hear that this is the first time that he has learned that. Again, the jury is now aware of just how much of Jennifer's DNA was found on what was dumped in those trash cans along Albany Avenue. You'll remember they saw the bloody Vineyard Vine shirt and cut bra during one of the hardest, most emotional days in the trial so far. The jury now knows, based on Kristen Maydale's testimony, that the item listed as Vineyard Vine shirt, size extra small on the arrest warrant, was consistent with Jennifer Dulos' DNA profile. Maydale made the same findings when it comes to that bra. The other known DNA profiles, including Fotis Dulos and Michelle Troconis, were eliminated on those two articles of clothing. All right, taking a look now at some of the other evidence that had Jennifer's DNA on them, the zip ties recovered from the trash. Some of the blood-like stains had presumptive positive tests for the presence of blood, but never those confirmatory tests for blood. So it's unclear what the source of the DNA was from, if it was indeed blood or not. Now, a number of other items, including a poncho, broken mop handle, and sponge, also had Jennifer's DNA. We also learned more about that new piece of evidence we first heard about last week, the white hard material recovered from Albany Avenue. It was never included in the arrest warrants in this case, and we still don't know what that material is. But we do know that it had human blood on it, And we now have learned from the DNA expert that it was indeed Jennifer's DNA found on that material.
The DNA profile from item 51S2-2 originating from a single female individual, assuming one individual. The DNA profile from 51S2-2 is at least 100 billion times more likely to occur if it originated from the source of the DNA profile from the swabbing of the electric toothbrush than if it originated from an unknown individual.
So as we hear Kristen Maydale read the results of her DNA analysis, you hear her say the electric toothbrush. That's Jennifer Doulos' toothbrush, which we saw a photo of early on in the trial. Police seized that toothbrush from Jennifer's New Canaan home to send to the lab for DNA comparison. Maydale doesn't say it was consistent with the DNA profile of Jennifer Doulos because investigators didn't physically collect the sample from her, since she was still missing and her body has never been recovered. Kevin, there was quite a delay between when the jury saw the physical evidence, including that bloody shirt and bra, and now they're learning about whose DNA indeed was on each item. It begs the question, does the prosecution here risk these results landing? Do they have the same impact as they would have if the DNA was presented earlier?
It could definitely be a risk because of that gap. But ultimately, if you think back to what the judge has said multiple times, he has faith in this jury. He believes this jury is smart and capable of following a complicated case. So, of course, he believes that this is a scenario where the jury will be able to follow. And because that was such a key piece of evidence, it's likely that they have been focused and waiting for those DNA results for a while now. So it's something that the prosecutors could risk, but it could be something as well that the judge believes won't impact the jury at all.
Much of the order of the testimony, Kevin, too, depends on the scheduling for these witnesses. Kevin Geis, live outside Stamford Superior Court. We will let you head back inside once again for what's expected to be a big day of testimony. In this case, still plenty more to come inside the trial of Michelle Troconis. Ahead, we are talking with Dr. Claire Glenn, an expert on forensic DNA, about some of the evidence we have seen so far and what it means for the jury. Stay with us. We'll be right back. And welcome back to Inside the Trial of Michelle Troconis. We are joined now by Dr. Claire Glenn, professor of forensic science at the Henry C. Lee College of Criminal Justice and Forensic Sciences at the University of New Haven. Thank you so much, Claire, for being with us today. We want to get to this testimony is a lot just for really anyone who doesn't deal in your world to just absorb. It's not as simple as Jennifer Doulos' DNA was found here, or Michelle Troconis' or Fotis Doulos'. It deals with the probabilities, right?
Sure.
Can you talk more about that?
Sure. So we've seen from the expert testimony given by the state forensic scientists the presence of various people's DNA on various different items throughout this case. And in particular, with regards to Michelle Troconis' DNA being present on the garbage bag, whenever we're looking at that, we have to look at it from a likelihood ratio. So the presence of her DNA and it being from a small amount of cells, as the defense attorney was reinforcing, just typically about 3 skin cells, yep. That's not really a major issue from a forensic scientist point of view, because for years and because of the advancement of our science, we've been able to get full DNA profiles from tiny amounts of DNA. So the question isn't about how much DNA or even whose DNA it is, it's more so about how did it get there? Mm-hmm. And the transfer of trace amounts of DNA onto objects is always a question that we have to critically think about and hypothesize of all the different various scenarios that could occur for it to be deposited there.
And both attorneys came up with those hypotheses yesterday for potentially how the DNA could have gotten there. We've heard a lot about touch DNA, transfer DNA, came up in the testimony on Monday. The prosecution and defense, of course, both presented those different scenarios for how Michelle Troconis' DNA, the small amount, the picogram amount, 3-cell amount was found on the garbage bag. So when it comes to DNA, and again, how it ended up on an item, is there really any definitive way to tell?
If there was video evidence of her actually touching the object, then you would have definitive evidence. However, whenever we're talking about trace amounts of DNA, we try and, as forensic scientists, avoid using the word touch DNA because that's inferring that the object was touched. So trace amounts of DNA is a good way to call it because it's a small amount, and we can't specifically say that she touched that object, but we also can't say that she didn't. So we have to look at it from both sides.
And Attorney John Schoenhorn, one of those scenarios was, again, part of her interview that she gave. That part's on camera about I was helping him with the trash bags. I was helping him clean up the Mountain Spring property before we went to Albany Avenue. Attorney John Schoenhorn reiterating multiple times that DNA found of his clients was equivalent of just 3 skin cells. The forensic examiner testifying said it's, again, not uncommon to develop profiles off such small samples. I can't imagine what sort of equipment you need to really hone in on that. From a scientific standpoint, should the fact of the amount, again, that it's so small, have any bearing on the jury's decision?
No, the amount really isn't anything to question here. We've been able to get full DNA profiles from tiny amounts for many years now. Again, as it's the advancement of the sequencing technologies that we have, even where it's like we have molecular photocopiers. So it's a robust, well-studied science. The science is there, it's accurate. Again, it just brings it back to how did it get there?
Right, and that's for the jury to come up with and fill in those gaps based on the information that's been presented. Let's talk now about, we're learning some terms here, mitochondrial DNA versus nuclear DNA. This came up in the testing of the human hair. Hair again on that sponge recovered along Albany Avenue was consistent with Pavel Gumieni's. We had never heard this before with mitochondrial DNA. What is the difference between the two of them and the impact on the jury when it comes to determining the difference between that?
Sure. So with hair in particular, whenever your hair is growing, your hair goes through this cycle of growth. And whenever it gets to the end cycle, your hair falls out from the root, from the top of your scalp. Whenever we have a rootless hair, which is what this hair was, that's indicating that this was a naturally fallen out hair because it ended at its root cycle growth. And so the issue that we have, and we've had for many years with rootless hairs, is that if we don't have that root, what we call a follicular tag at the top of the hair, we don't have nuclear DNA. And nuclear DNA is the DNA that we inherit from our biological mother and our biological father, 50% from each. Whereas along the length of a hair, along the strand or the shaft, we call it, inside of there we have mitochondrial DNA, no nuclear DNA. Well, we might have some. There's some extraction methods that are being developed. So with that mitochondrial DNA, you're inheriting that only from your mother. And so it's passed down along the maternal line. The mother will pass it on to her offspring, sons and daughters. One
of the big questions, of course, going into today's expected testimony with Pavel Gumieni, again, is that question that remains. How did the hair end up there? Maybe that testimony could help point the jury in that direction as we start to learn more. More to come with Dr. Claire Glenn. We'll continue to dig into that DNA evidence when we come back. And welcome back. We are here once again with Dr. Claire Glenn, professor of forensic science at the Henry Seeley College of Criminal Justice and Forensic Sciences at the University of New Haven. You have been following this forensic DNA testimony closely. I asked you earlier, I said the forensics world has to be a small world, right? Yes. And when something like this is on a high profile case, you guys all kind of tune in. I want to ask you about your takeaways so far about the processes the experts in the lab have followed. How do you feel that they're doing with explaining this analysis and that explanation they've given to the jury?
Absolutely. I mean, I've watched from the testimony that I've watched given by the prosecution's state forensic scientists, they've done an excellent job. They've explained things accurately, concisely, clearly. They haven't overstated anything. And they've explained what they do in a forensic lab, which is important for the jury to understand and for the layperson to understand. Our field isn't just a follow steps 1 to 10 and you get your answer. We have to use a lot of critical thinking, a lot of strategy throughout, and stop and look and observe and reform your strategy.
Yeah.
For example, with the precious amounts of samples.
Right. You've got to make sure you're not over-testing
Absolutely.
them, right?
With the potential blood evidence that was located in the car after cleaning, from the cleaning process alone, that's already diluting down a lot of the DNA. There may still be traces, but it's going to be very difficult to get DNA from that. Then if you're adding the luminol reagent, which is what they did do in this case, in order to get that presumptive positive, that dilutes it further.
Yeah, so no more of those, you get that point, you say the DNA test rather than the confirmatory test, and we can know exactly who it belongs to.
The DNA test is going to be more important than confirming that it is human blood. We have the presumptive positive that's indicating that it's likely to be blood.
Thank you for breaking it all down.
No
it's
problem.
a lot to, again, for those of us who aren't in your world to absorb. We appreciate your insight. Thank you for being with us today. Hope to have you back. That includes our exclusive Inside the Trial of Michelle Troconis streaming special. We appreciate you watching, and we'll see you back next time.